If one freezing winter day, you come across a young woman curled up in the snow, her wedding dress soaked and cold, clutching a notebook filled with names that perhaps no one has ever heard of, what would you do? Would you turn your back, letting the winter wind sweep away her loneliness? Or would you step forward, take her trembling hands, and become the only warmth amidst the blinding snowstorm? This is the story of an abandoned bride, of a single father who had once lost everything, and of a winter blank. It seemed to be the coldest of all, yet became the beginning of a miracle. A story about choices, about hands holding onto each other when the world turns away, about a love that needs no flowery words, only the steadfast presence of someone who stays day after day. If you believe that the most beautiful things do not always need to be ostentatious, but exist in the simplest moments, stay and listen to this story. If someone were to ask you, what would you do if you saw a pregnant bride, curled up in the snow, her wedding dress soaked and frozen, and she whispered through trembling breaths, "No one wants my baby." Would you turn your back, letting the cold wind bury that pain in silence? Or would you step forward, stretch out your hands to hold hers, even if you have nothing else to offer but the warmth of your humanity? Let me tell you this story. The story begins in Silver Pines, a small town nestled on the slopes of the Colorado Mountains, where winter not only arrives early but bites colder than anywhere else. That day, the first snowstorm of the season descended upon the town like sad white blossoms falling from the sky, blanketing every cobblestone street, every humble rooftop, and even the front yard of the old Pinecrest Chapel. Right there, on the snowy steps of that chapel, amidst the frigid whiteness, a solitary figure emerged like a melancholic ink stain on pristine snow. Sophie Harper, the young woman whose rounded belly was unmistakable beneath the pure white of her wedding dress, sat silently, clutching a worn leather notebook close to her chest. Her gown was stained with muddy streaks, the hem dragging through the freezing snow. Her once neatly styled hair was now tangled, matted with melting snow. Dark strands clung to her wind-reddened cheeks, deepening the storm in her eyes, as if they held within them the fury of a raging sea. Her phone, tucked in her coat pocket, had just buzzed for the last time. She already knew that message by heart, but she still looked out of bitter habit. A simple, devastating line from the man she had believed to be her safe harbor. "I'm sorry, I can't." That message extinguished all her hopes, every promise, every simple dream of a home. Brandon Mills, the father of her unborn child, had chosen the most straightforward way out, to run away. Sophie did not cry, not because she was strong, but because the searing cold had frozen even her tears. Perhaps she had cried them all out on those endless nights before, when a fragile hope still flickered within her, the hope that if she dared to wear the wedding dress, everything would change. But it hadn't. With numb fingers, Sophie opened the worn leather notebook on her lap. On the first page were the names she had once whispered to the child growing within her. Clara, a gentle light in the cold winter. Alora, a hope that forever lives in her mother's heart. Now, those names felt like lost stars in a night sky of endless white snow. Her voice, hoarse and brittle, escaped her lips like a whisper carried away by the wind. "No one wants my baby." In that moment, when everything seemed to have sunk into silence, fate gently shifted. Right then, from behind the side door of Pinecrest Chapel, the creaking of hinges echoed in the cold wind. Daniel Carter, the violinist hired for the now-cancelled wedding, stepped out, carrying his violin case and a bundle of damp, smudged sheet music. He thought the chapel had long been emptied. But then, he heard it, a voice so faint it might have been mistaken for the wind. Yet it gripped his heart tightly. "No one wants my baby." Daniel froze, his heart twisted painfully. He had played at many weddings in his life, had witnessed countless joyous smiles. But never had he seen a bride sitting alone in the snow, whispering words soaked in such profound loneliness. He could have walked away. Everyone would have understood. But he didn't. Not today. Not for this woman. Not when his heart recognized a pain so deeply familiar. The fateful turning point had arrived. the silence was broken. And Daniel's steps carried him toward Sophie, opening a chapter neither of them could have foreseen. Blank. Underscore. Blank. Blank. Underscore. Blank. On the snow-covered steps of the old chapel, Sophie sat curled up like a wounded bird in the dead of winter. The once elegant wedding dress, once a symbol of joy and celebration, was now soaked through and caked with dirt. Clinging to her body like a white mourning shroud of despair, her chestnut hair, once carefully curled, had come undone, tangled by icy wind and tears alike. The wind whipped across her face like the cruel hand of fate, bitter. Cutting. Snow fell thick around her, covering the traces of guests who had long departed, leaving behind only a hollow, icy silence. And there she was, alone. Her hands gripped tightly onto the old leather notebook, the last talisman she had in a world crumbling around her. The names written inside were no longer just names. They were tiny hopes she had whispered into the night, like stars she tried to light in the darkened sky of her life. She whispered, barely audible, "No one wants my baby." Her frail voice was swept away by the wind, echoing against the stained glass windows of the chapel, as if even the heavens were repeating her despair. Just then, Daniel Carter stepped out from the side door of the chapel. He had just finished helping the priest pack away instruments and close the church after the cancelled wedding. In his hands was an old violin case and a stack of music sheets, blurred with damp ink. At first, he assumed the chapel yard was deserted, like every other winter night after a ceremony. But then he heard that fragile whisper, one that didn't sound like the wind or a hollow echo, but a voice broken from deep pain, a confession uttered only to oneself. He froze. His eyes, accustomed to witnessing every shade of sorrow through his performances, now fell upon what looked like a soul frozen but still faintly breathing. Daniel stepped slowly toward Sophie, his boots crunching softly in the thick snow, each step as careful as a heartbeat nearing panic. He knew that one wrong move could shatter her like ice beneath fragile feet. He didn't rush. He approached her gently, the way one might reach out to a frightened baby bird. "Are you all right?" Daniel spoke softly, his voice as gentle as wind through pine trees. A small question, yet enough to crack the thick layer of ice between them. Sophie didn't answer. She clutched the notebook tighter, as if letting go would cause even her last hopes to slip away into the snow. Daniel didn't step back. His gaze fell upon the frayed edges of the leather notebook, where a blurred name stood out clearly. Clara Hope. A single name, yet it felt like an entire world. "That's a beautiful name," Daniel said gently, his voice warm like a campfire in the dead of night. "Why don't you let her hear it?" Sophie flinched, as if that gentle question had peeled away her last layer of armor. Her eyes welled with tears, but they remained dry, like someone who had long since cried themselves empty. "Because I'm not good enough," she whispered, her voice cracked like the wind passing through bare winter branches. "Because no one wants me and my baby." Daniel stood still. No hollow reassurance could fix what was broken. "No, it's going to be okay," would sound anything but false in this moment. Instead, he did the one thing the world had long forgotten. He knelt before her. He reached out, not as a savior, but as someone choosing to stand beside her. He took Sophie's hand, frozen, trembling, and so delicate it felt like it might dissolve into snow. His hands, warm, steady, were like a flame lighting a hearth in her. Sophie was stunned. How long had it been since someone touched her not out of pity? Not out of obligation? She didn't even remember anymore. But now, she was no longer alone in that white, empty world. The warmth from Daniel's hands spread not just through her fingers, but through her very soul. In her eyes, a faint glimmer returned, a tiny, trembling light, but enough to tether her to life again. He didn't pull her up. He didn't urge her to move. He just held her hand. And in that silence, Daniel seemed to say with his very presence, "You are not alone." In the endless chill of winter, amid the wind-blown silences and breathless sobs, one thing remained unshaken, the warmth of a human heart. Daniel did not rescue Sophie, but he had planted a small flame inside her, and sometimes one flame is enough to light the whole winter. Blank. Underscore. Blank. Blank. underscore, blank, blank, underscore, blank. The road from Pinecrest Chapel to Daniel's cabin, at first glance, was only a few short miles through the ancient woods, but that night, for Sophie, it felt as if she were crossing a lifetime. The snow did not merely fall, it poured down in thick, blinding sheets, as though the sky had descended to smother the earth below. The headlights of Daniel's truck strained to pierce through the suffocating snow mist, but the pale beams could only carve out a few feet of visibility ahead. The windshield wipers fought valiantly, working at full force, but the freezing wind instantly sealed over the cleared glass with fresh ice. Inside the cab, the confined space became a fragile sanctuary separating them from the roaring storm outside. Sophie sat huddled, her frozen hands clutching the worn leather notebook against her belly as though it were the last ember of warmth she had left. Daniel had given her his heavy coat, and she wrapped it tightly around herself, feeling the warmth slowly seep into her skin. But her body still felt cold, not just from the bitter weather, but from the lingering chill within her heart. Her eyes stared quietly through the fogged-up window. Snowflakes slammed relentlessly against the glass, each flake a cold reminder of the rejection, abandonment, and deep loneliness she had endured that day. No one inside the truck spoke. But it was not an awkward silence. It was a silence of understanding, as if both knew that some wounds needed no words to be acknowledged. The heater hummed softly, battling to push back the freezing air. But there was only one thing keeping Sophie from falling apart completely: Daniel's hand, occasionally tightening on the steering wheel, as if silently reminding her, we're still moving forward, even if just a few feet at a time through the thick white veil. When the truck finally turned onto the narrow path leading to the cabin, Daniel glanced sideways at Sophie, his deep voice breaking the hush. Just think of this place as a shelter for the night, he said, his voice roughened by the cold. But I hope it gives you a little peace. The warm yellow light glowing from the cabin's window spilled out like a lighthouse beacon in the endless sea of snow. Smoke curled gently from the chimney, blending with the falling snow like fragile threads weaving life back into the frozen world. As the truck came to a stop, Daniel quickly rounded to Sophie's side, opening the door and offering his hand. It wasn't a polite formality, it was the instinct of a man who knew the woman before him carried not just a child, but the weight of an entire world. From inside the cabin, a boy of about 6 years old burst out into the snow. His cheeks flushed red with cold, his bright eyes twinkling like little beads of onyx. "Daddy, who's that?" the boy called out, his voice high and clear, cutting through the heavy air. Daniel crouched down, his eyes gentle as a winter flame. "A friend, Lucas," he replied softly. "A friend who needs a place to rest." Lucas tilted his head, his curious gaze falling to Sophie's belly. His wide, innocent eyes held no judgment, no suspicion, only pure childlike wonder. Then, with the bright discovery of a new idea, he asked, "Is the baby in her belly our new friend too?" Sophie froze, her heart tightened painfully. That innocent question struck a chord deep within her soul, a place that had only heard words of rejection and shame for so long. Without hesitation, Daniel nodded. "Yes," he said, "a new friend, and the miracle of this winter." Lucas clapped his hands in delight, his rosy cheeks glowing even brighter. "I'll call the baby Jellybean," he declared with pure excitement. In that moment, in the midst of the cold, in the depths of the endless night, Sophie found herself unexpectedly smiling. It was a small, hesitant smile, but real, her first true smile since she had been left alone on the chapel steps. That smile, fragile as it was, like a winter branch trembling in the wind, was the first sign of life returning to her. The cabin was no longer just a temporary shelter. It had become the first haven, where an innocent child had welcomed the life growing within Sophie, not with whispers of gossip or judgment, but with pure-hearted joy, calling her baby Jellybean, and with that tiny spark of laughter. Inside the small wooden house in the heart of winter, Sophie felt something she thought she had lost forever. Hope, blank, underscore, blank, blank, underscore, blank. Inside the rustic cabin nestled deep within the pines of silver pines. The air carried the gentle warmth of a fire crackling in the hearth. Outside the window, snow continued to fall, blanketing the wooden steps, weighing down the heavy branches of the evergreens. But inside, a small world was slowly being reignited. With the simplest things, the soft glow of an oil lamp spread like warm honey across the old wooden table, casting its light upon the frayed leather notebook Sophie still held tightly in her hands. She had not let it go, not even as she walked through the biting storm, because within it lay her most precious treasures, the names, the dreams, the quiet wishes she had whispered to her unborn child. Lucas, his bright brown eyes sparkling with curiosity, stretched over the table, gently reaching for the notebook. He didn't speak right away. Instead, he carefully turned the worn cover, as if afraid to hurt a book already carrying too many silent sorrows. Then, with a voice as innocent and clear as fresh fallen snow, Lucas whispered, "Ma'am, what's inside this book?" Sophie froze. That question, so simple yet so heavy, cut deeper than any winter wind she had ever faced. She hesitated, her fingers brushing gently over the notebook's weathered cover, as though seeking courage from its aged leather. Daniel, seated nearby, watched her closely. He did not rush her. He simply waited with patient understanding, as if he knew, some doors in the soul can only be opened from the inside. Sophie swallowed hard. Then, with a quiet breath, she opened the book. On the first page, her handwriting appeared, slanted yet soft, trembling like the cracks across frozen lakes. Clara Hope, a gentle light in the bitter winter. Daniel leaned closer, his eyes drawn to the words, his fingertips brushing the edge of the page as if afraid to disturb something sacred. Clara Hope, he murmured, his voice warm and deep, like a rare spring breeze amid winter's chill. That's a beautiful name. A small, strong hope. Sophie's throat tightened. She nodded, unable to speak. Then, unexpectedly, Lucas spoke up, his voice bright with excitement. "I want to name the baby, too. Let's call her Jellybean," he exclaimed, eyes wide with delight. "Because she's so tiny and sweet. Just like a jelly bean." The room seemed to brighten instantly with his innocent joy. Daniel chuckled softly, but the most surprising reaction came from Sophie. Her smile. Her real smile. Not a forced or weary smile, but a true, radiant one. The kind that reached her eyes, glistening now not with tears of sorrow, but with tears warmed by hope. The notebook, once a relic of a forsaken future, was now opening to a new story. In this small, humble cabin, amid the crackling of dry wood in the hearth and the warm light of the oil lamp, 3 souls who had once been strangers were now quietly writing the next chapter of their lives. A chapter no longer soaked in hopeless tears, but filled with love, warmth, and a quiet yet enduring belief that miracles can still happen, even in the harshest winter. The notebook, once a symbol of loneliness, had become a place where these 3 souls could spark new hope. Not only with names, but with smiles, warm tears, and an unspoken promise. They would never let loneliness return. Blank. Blank. The snowstorm had quieted, but another storm, colder and more relentless, crept silently into Sophie's life. The storm called Gossip. Silver Pines, with its snow-covered rooftops and winding, postcard-perfect streets, was a place where secrets never truly slept. News, even the smallest whispers, would slip beneath doorways and drift through chimney smoke, fanning into flames before anyone could stop it. Sophie felt it from the moment she stepped into the town's tiny general store. The wind chimes on the wooden door jingled, offering what sounded like a greeting, but beneath it lurked a silent warning. The air inside the shop felt colder than the air outside. The cashier, a middle-aged woman with eyes as sharp as an ice shard, glanced at Sophie. Then her gaze drifted downward to Sophie's unmistakable pregnant belly. Her voice, when she spoke, was cool and cutting. "You're the woman staying with Daniel Carter, aren't you?" It wasn't a question. It was an accusation. Sophie drew a deep breath, steadying herself, and replied simply, "Yes." Around her, other customers pretended to examine goods, but their sharp glances cut through the layers of her clothing like daggers. She heard the murmured words. The widow moves on fast. Doesn't she? Where did she come from anyway? No one knows her background. The cashier continued, her voice now laced with scorn barely hidden beneath a thin veil of civility. A man like Daniel, he needs time to grieve. He doesn't need extra trouble. Sophie felt heat rising to her cheeks, her heart pounding painfully against her ribs. But before she could even form a reply, a hand settled gently but firmly on her shoulder. It was Daniel. He stood there, steady as an old pine weathering the harshest winter, his eyes calm yet unyielding. Who stays in my house? He said slowly, clearly, his voice carrying the weight of quiet authority. Is no concern of this town. The cashier pursed her lips tightly, saying nothing more. As they walked back through the snowy streets, Sophie clutched her shopping bag close to her chest. The wind bit at her skin, but it wasn't as cold as the words she had just endured. They'll never stop, will they? She asked, her voice barely more than a whisper. Daniel, walking beside her, didn't look at the town. His gaze remained fixed on her. No, he answered honestly. But they don't live your life. He paused, then turned to face her fully, his eyes deep and steady like a mountain lake unfrozen beneath the surface. And they're not raising your child. Sophie met his gaze, for the first time since being left in the snow. Her eyes held something other than pain. There was a flicker of something stronger. Something that refused to be extinguished. No more words were needed. Amid the cutting stares and sharp-edged whispers, Sophie stood tall. Beside her stood Daniel, a man who didn't make grand promises but simply stayed. A quiet, unwavering presence. Together, they walked on. Blank, underscore, blank, blank, underscore, blank. The knock at the door that day was different. It was heavy, urgent, as if someone were trying to challenge the very storm they knew they could not escape. Through the frost-blurred window, Sophie immediately recognized the figure. Brandon Mills. He stood there, wrapped in an expensive city overcoat that seemed out of place in this humble, snowbound setting, still carrying the old arrogance of a man from the world she had left behind. When she opened the door, the cold slapped against her skin. But Sophie no longer shivered. Sophie. His voice was lower than she remembered. You look different. She held her back straight, her eyes unwavering. I am different. Brandon's gaze dropped to her belly, where their child was soon to arrive. His eyes faltered, just for a moment, as the reality of what he had abandoned took shape before him. I know I made a mistake, Brandon said, a rare flicker of uncertainty in his usually smug demeanor. I want to try again. I can make it right. Sophie gave a faint, almost serene smile. Not bitter, not mocking. Simply the smile of a woman who had walked through her darkest nights and no longer feared anything. You had your chance, Brandon, she replied, her words cutting through the cold like a blade forged from truth. You had it when I stood there, in the snow, wearing my wedding dress, pregnant, and waiting for you. The wind picked up, blowing her hair back, revealing the full strength of her resolve. Behind her, Daniel stepped onto the porch. He didn't speak. He didn't need to. Brandon's eyes flicked toward him, and the weight of defeat settled over him like fresh snowfall. You choose him, then? Brandon asked, his voice hollow. Sophie met his gaze squarely, nodding with quiet certainty. No words were necessary. She didn't have to explain that she was choosing not just a man, but safety, constancy, someone who had stood beside her, with no promises of perfection, but with a steadfast heart that never wavered. Sophie was no longer the abandoned woman in the snow. She was the one closing the door now, not just against the winter wind, but forever shutting out the chapter that had wounded her so deeply. The storm howled outside, as if nature itself was testing the courage of those sheltering in the small cabin nestled in the woods of silver pines. Fresh snow piled heavily upon the roof. The windows rattled under the weight of the gusting wind, and icy drafts slipped through every crack and crevice. Inside, the fire in the hearth flickered but held strong. Daniel carefully fed more logs into the fire, his eyes never straying far from Sophie, who sat by the warmth, cradling her belly, her face pale. Lucas, with the brave innocence of a 6-year-old, gently pulled a heavy blanket over her shoulders. I'll keep you and the baby warm, he whispered. Sophie tried to smile, but a sudden contraction twisted her face in pain. Daniel. Her voice trembled with ragged breaths. I think it's time. Daniel stiffened but didn't panic. Quickly checking his phone, he saw the signal was long gone. There would be no help coming. No one to arriving on time. Only them, inside this modest cabin, in the heart of a howling blizzard. He steadied himself, reaching for her hand, holding it tightly. We'll get through this, he said firmly. I'm here, I'm not going anywhere. Fear flickered in Sophie's eyes despite her brave front. If something happens to me, if I don't. Daniel cut her off with a voice so firm, so sure, that it stilled her fears. We will get through this. There's no if. He lit candles and set them around the bedroom, heated water on the wood stove, and prepared clean towels, everything they would need for an emergency delivery. Outside, the storm raged on, but inside, time seemed to stretch painfully slow. Sophie fought to keep her breathing steady, biting her lip to stifle cries of pain, not wanting Lucas to worry. But when the contractions grew fiercer, a desperate sound escaped her throat. Daniel remained by her side, telling her stories of the first time he had held Lucas. Hands trembling in fear he might drop the fragile little life of Lena, his late wife, who had once painted clouds on the nursery ceiling so Lucas could dream of endless adventures. And once, Daniel said, his voice thick with quiet emotion, I dreamt I was standing in a snowy field. A little girl ran to me and called me, Daddy. Sophie's eyes glistened, tears rolling down her cheeks from pain and something deeper. Maybe, she rasped. That was Clara. Daniel said nothing. He only gripped her hand tighter, his eyes speaking the words his voice could not. Finally, the moment arrived. Sophie gritted her teeth, gathering every ounce of strength for the final push. Outside, the storm seemed to roar in unison with her effort. And then, a cry. The first cry of life pierced through the howling winds. Daniel caught the tiny, slippery child in his trembling hands, wrapping her in the softest blanket in the cabin. His eyes, filled with tears, looked at Sophie as he gently placed the baby in her arms. Welcome to the world, he whispered hoarsely. Welcome, little one. Sophie, drenched in sweat and tears, cradled her daughter against her chest, as though holding the entire universe in her arms. Clara Hope, she whispered, her smile breaking through her exhaustion and tears. You are my hope. Amidst the howling storm, a new life had arrived, Clara Hope Carter. Not just a child, but living proof that love and courage could survive even in the fiercest of winters. Blank, underscore, blank, blank, underscore, blank. After the storm's fury subsided, it was as if the entire world held its breath. That morning, pale sunlight filtered through the misty veil draped over the pine trees. Droplets of melted frost clung to the window panes, sparkling like tiny gems in the winter air. Inside the cabin, a small, fragile world had begun to awaken. Sophie was still weak, but there was a gentle smile resting on her lips as she gazed down at baby Clara sleeping peacefully in her arms. Her daughter's soft, golden hair glowed like the pale winter sunlight. Daniel stood not far away, his eyes filled with emotion too deep for words as he watched the scene before him. He didn't need to speak, his heart was full of something he hadn't felt in a very long time, home. Lucas crept into the room, hugging his favorite stuffed bunny, his fingers still dusted with flour from the clumsy cookies he had tried to make for breakfast. Is Mama Snow feeling better? Lucas asked softly, his round eyes filled with concern. Sophie nodded, her voice warm despite her exhaustion. Thank you, Lucas. Thanks to you and Daddy. Clara and I are doing just fine. Lucas beamed, rushing over to peek at the newborn cradled in Sophie's arms. Can we call her Jellybean? He asked eagerly, tilting his head in curiosity. Daniel chuckled gently, his gaze affectionate. Clara Jellybean Hope Carter, he said, playfully emphasizing the nickname as though to seal the memory in his heart forever. Lucas clapped his hands, his face lighting up like the sun piercing through clouds. I love that name. The warmth inside the cabin felt rare and precious. But something even more special was waiting just beyond. That afternoon, in the town's small square, the snow had been cleared away for the annual winter festival to go on as planned. Warm lights glowed from booths selling pastries and hot cocoa. Children's laughter rang through the chilly air, brushing away the last remnants of the storm's bitterness. Daniel guided Sophie carefully through the crowd, his arm wrapped protectively around her, a silent vow of safety and comfort. Sophie still felt tired, but her eyes shimmered brighter than any lantern that night. Across her chest, draped over her winter coat, was a soft white sash embroidered in delicate golden thread. The words stitched onto it glimmered under the lamplight. "The vow I keep." Daniel, carrying his violin, stepped onto the small stage at the heart of the festival, where the townsfolk had gathered in a circle around him. Silence fell as he raised his instrument. And then, music filled the air, not grand or ostentatious, but gentle and pure, a melody that carried with it every word his heart longed to say. About love, about bravery, about the quiet belief in miracles, no matter how small. As the last note faded into the crisp evening air, the crowd was silent for a heartbeat, and then they applauded, not boisterously, but with an understanding warmth. "We heard you. And we understand." Daniel turned toward Sophie, his gaze locking onto hers like an anchor. "I don't have a wedding ring," he said, his voice hoarse with emotion. "But I have this." He reached out, his fingers tracing the embroidered words on her sash. "This is the vow I keep. Not just today, but every day that follows." Sophie's eyes sparkled with unshed tears as she replied, her voice thick but unwavering. "And I choose you," she said softly. "No ceremony, no ring needed. This is enough." Daniel bowed his head, gently pressing his forehead to hers, as though engraving this promise into his very soul. No diamond ring, no extravagant proposal, just the truth, just two people choosing each other, fully and freely. That winter in Silver Pines was unlike any other. After a storm that could have swallowed everything, the town seemed to rise like something out of a storybook. Snow-laden pines stood tall, rooftops blanketed in white softened like icing on gingerbread houses, and golden lights from windows cast a cozy glow into the chilly air. Inside the little cabin, once just a place of refuge, life had begun to take root. Clara Hope Carter grew stronger each day. Her tiny fingers clung tightly to Lucas's hand, as though holding on to her entire world. Lucas, proud and attentive, cared for her with the earnestness of a big brother, pointing out light patterns on the ceiling and listening to the lullabies Daniel played on his violin each evening by the fire. One morning, while Sophie brewed ginger tea in the kitchen, Lucas ran in, his eyes wide with wonder. "Mama Snow," he cried out. "The baby's smiling. She's smiling." Sophie rushed over, her heart swelling as she saw Clara's face light up with a genuine, unmistakable smile. It wasn't the sleepy reflexive smile of a newborn. It was real, a smile of a child who felt the love surrounding her. Sophie scooped her daughter into her arms, whispering, "You picked the perfect time, Clara, just when your mama needed it most." Daniel entered, his hands still dusted with resin from splitting firewood, but his eyes shone like morning sunlight. "Every one of her smiles is a miracle," he said softly, brushing away the tear slipping down Sophie's cheek. Slowly, their cabin filled with signs of life. Milk bottles lined the kitchen counter beside an old jar of honey. Lucas's drawings hung proudly on the walls, many of them depicting a family of 4, a man with curly hair, a woman with a radiant smile, and a bundled-up baby labeled, Jellybean, in scribbled letters. In the afternoons, Daniel played his violin as Sophie and Lucas baked cookies, their laughter mixing with the melody, drifting through the open windows into the crisp winter air. It was simple, it was imperfect, and it was home. Blank, underscore, blank, blank, underscore, blank. In the cozy little cabin, tucked away beneath the snow-laden branches of silver pines, life continued to unfold quietly, like the turning of soft pages in an old, beloved book. Sophie, now stronger, sat by the window with her old leather notebook resting in her lap. The same notebook that had once felt like her only lifeline, her last fragile hope in a cold, indifferent world. Now, it was different. The gentle light from the hearth danced across the faded cover, warming its creases and worn edges. Carefully, she opened it. On the first page remained the name she had written on that bitter day in the snow. Clara Hope, a gentle light in the bitter winter. Her eyes softened as she traced the letters with her fingertip, feeling not the ache of loneliness, but the warmth of memories being rewritten. Behind her, Daniel moved about the cabin, quietly stacking fresh logs near the fire, while Lucas, ever the curious explorer, leaned over the table to peer into the open notebook. He didn't rush to ask his usual playful questions. Instead, with the care of a child who sensed something special, he softly inquired, "Mama Snow, what are you writing now?" Sophie paused for a heartbeat, her fingers lingering on the page. Daniel watched her, saying nothing, waiting patiently as though he understood. This was her moment, her choice. With a steady breath, Sophie picked up her pen. Her handwriting, once shaky and broken, now flowed more confidently, as though warmed by the very fire crackling in the hearth. On the next blank page, she wrote, "I am not a burden. I am always loved." A quiet declaration, not just for her child, but for herself. Daniel stepped closer, his gaze falling upon the words. He said nothing, but the gentle squeeze of his hand on her shoulder spoke volumes. Lucas, bright-eyed with curiosity, clapped his hands together. "Mama Snow, I want to write something too." Sophie smiled and passed the pen to him. With determined focus, Lucas scribbled beneath her words. "Family means never being alone." The letters were uneven and childish, but they were perfect. They were true. The room filled with a soft glow that had nothing to do with the flickering fire. It was the glow of a family being forged, not through grand gestures or perfect plans, but through small, everyday miracles. A laugh here, a name whispered in the dark, a hand held through a storm. Their old, battered notebook, once a silent witness to Sophie's loneliest moments, was now becoming a living testament to hope reborn. Each page no longer marked by desperation, but by new beginnings, by love, by family. As evening fell, and Clara slept soundly in her crib, Lucas yawned and climbed onto Daniel's lap, cuddling close as Daniel played a gentle tune on his violin. Sophie watched them, her heart full to the brim, overflowing with quiet joy, and then, as if guided by instinct, she turned to the last page of the notebook and began to write once more. Her words, simple but powerful, flowed from her pen as though they had always been waiting to be written. The girl who once sat alone in the snow no longer waits for miracles. She has become one. Blank, underscore, blank, blank, underscore, blank, blank, underscore, blank. The storm had passed, but in small towns like Silver Pines, whispers always lingered longer than snow on rooftops. As winter's grip loosened, Daniel and Sophie knew they couldn't hide in the warmth of the cabin forever. One morning, with Clara bundled safely in a soft blanket and Lucas skipping excitedly ahead, they stepped out into the crisp, bright air. The snow beneath their boots crunched sharply, but the chill felt softer now, less biting, less harsh. As they walked toward the heart of town, Sophie felt familiar eyes upon her. The same gazes that once judged, that once whispered sharp-edged doubts into the frosty air. But this time, something was different. Daniel walked beside her, his hand steady on her back, his presence like a shield of quiet strength. They passed the small bakery, where Mrs. Waverly, the baker's wife, paused in the middle of arranging pastries behind the frosted glass. For a brief moment, her eyes met Sophie's. Then, slowly, almost imperceptibly, she nodded. Sophie's heart skipped a beat, not out of fear, but surprise. Next came Mr. Aldridge, the grocer, who used to avoid meeting her gaze altogether. But today, he tipped his hat ever so slightly. A silent acknowledgement. Whispers still swirled, like snowflakes catching on the breeze. "That's her, isn't it? The bride left in the snow. She survived." Survived. The word no longer felt like a scar. It felt like a badge of honor. At the town square, they found themselves once again at the heart of the winter festival. Children chased each other between booths selling roasted chestnuts and steaming mugs of cocoa. Lucas ran ahead, his laughter ringing bright and clear. "Come on, Mama Snow," he called. "Come see the snow fort." Sophie smiled, her heart swelling at his joy. Daniel turned to her, his voice soft beneath the festival's cheer. "You don't have to prove anything to them," he said. Sophie met his gaze, her own steady and sure. "I'm not here to prove anything," she replied gently. "I'm here to live." They moved through the square, not as outcasts, but as a family shaped not by perfection, but by perseverance. At the center of the square stood a wooden stage, still decorated from the festival's opening night. Daniel, ever the quiet artist, took his place there once more, raising his violin beneath the winter sun. This time, the melody he played was different. It wasn't the mournful song of longing, nor the hesitant tune of beginnings. It was bold, joyful, a song of triumph over the cold. Sophie stood with Clara in her arms, Lucas by her side, as the music rose and swept through the crowd. People stopped. They listened, and slowly, almost like sunlight melting the last frost, smiles began to thaw their frozen faces. When the music ended, the applause was genuine, warm, not thunderous, but honest. Daniel lowered his violin, and Sophie, standing proud and strong, felt the final pieces of the old fears crumble away. They were no longer whispers in the snow. They were voices in the sunlight. "Mama Snow," Lucas cried, pulling at her hand. "Can we write more in your notebook tonight?" Sophie laughed, bright and free, as Daniel stepped down from the stage and slipped his hand into hers. "Yes," she said, her voice ringing clear. "Tonight, we'll write the next chapter together." As they walked back toward the cabin, Sophie stole one last glance at the townspeople, at the nods, the smiles, the quiet acceptance blooming like early spring beneath the winter frost. For the first time, she saw not a town filled with judgment, but a town learning to understand. And perhaps, she thought, that was the true miracle of winter. Blank. Blank. Winter slowly released its hold over Silver Pines. Though snow still blanketed the rooftops and hillsides, it now felt less like a burden and more like a comforting quilt draped over the town. Inside the little cabin, life pulsed with warmth and gentle laughter. Sophie stood by the window, the old leather notebook still in her hands. What once had been her fragile talisman in the depths of despair had now become a cherished treasury of new beginnings. She turned to the first page, where she had once written with trembling fingers, "Clara Hope, a gentle light in the bitter winter." Smiling softly, she reached for her pen. With steady, confident strokes, she added beneath it, "The girl who once sat alone in the snow no longer waits for miracles. She has found her home." Behind her, Daniel stepped close, wrapping his arms around her shoulders, his breath warm against her ear. "What are you writing?" he asked gently. Sophie turned, her eyes bright, glowing even warmer than the fire crackling in the hearth. "I'm writing to the girl I used to be," she answered, her voice filled with quiet strength. "So she'll know, I've found my way home." Daniel smiled and pressed a tender kiss to her forehead. Before either of them could say more, Lucas tumbled into the room, his laughter filling every corner of the cabin. Behind him, little Clara toddled after, holding up a scribbled drawing of their family, her steps wobbly but determined. "We're winter astronauts," Lucas announced proudly, a cooking pot balanced precariously on his head like a space helmet. Sophie couldn't help but laugh, a full, unrestrained laugh, as if every weight she had ever carried had melted away. Daniel watched her, his gaze full of warmth. "No one saved you from that storm, Sophie," he said, his voice low and filled with quiet admiration. "You saved yourself." Sophie met his eyes, no words needed, as the snow began to fall once again, soft and quiet outside the window. They stepped out together, their little family leaving fresh footprints in the pristine blanket of white. Every step they took was a declaration. They had chosen each other. Not because they had been rescued, but because they had rescued themselves, and each other. The woman who had once sat alone in the snow, whispering her fears into the frozen wind, no longer waited for miracles. She had become a miracle. Together with the man who stayed and two children who carried within them life, love, and endless hope. She had built a home. Once upon a time, Sophie would one day tell Clara. In the middle of the coldest winter, there was a woman who thought she was alone. But she wasn't. Clara would reply, eyes wide with wonder. No, my love, Sophie would say, her heart full. Because family isn't about grand promises or perfect beginnings. Family is about choosing each other. Every single day. Even in the storm? Lucas would ask. Especially in the storm, Daniel would answer, smiling. And so, their story continued. Through seasons yet to come. Through winters and springs. Through laughter and tears. A story not of perfection, but of perseverance, of quiet bravery, and of love, the kind of love that needs no grand declaration. Only the simple act of staying. And if you, dear reader, ever find yourself lost in a storm, remember this. You do not need someone to save you. You only need someone who chooses to stay. And maybe, just maybe, you'll realize, you were the miracle all along. Blank. _Blank.